So we're live in the spin room. It's Mark and Abagael.
Hello there.
SCI-Arc thesis reviews. I have to ask you a question, and then we just talk, right?
Yes,
because I remember
of
your
course.
project begins. Your project begins with this question of the formless, and you look at all these non-Western forms which might be formless, and you end up with a model of Los Angeles covered with bubblegum.
Yes.
So I just need for you some explanation of how you got from the non-Western formless to bubblegum in Los Angeles.
So at the end of the thesis prep stage, what we kind of discovered was that, it was a little tricky of which way to take forward through the project, because there's a lot of instances in which you could step into a route of cultural appropriation. And so...
And that's not good?
No, not good.
Why is that?
Especially because it's not to appropriate other cultures and to take what's theirs that they've attached so much meaning to and attached so much, whether it's religious or cultural value or just, environmental use of, local materials and stuff. It has very, symbolic uses to those particular people. And so you as a person, you cannot particularly walk in their shoes because you didn't grow up with that same experience that they did. So you don't attach the same meaning that they do, especially to something so intimate as like a home or somewhere where you go to worship or, live your daily life. So
that sounds right, but does that mean I should feel bad about eating in a Japanese restaurant?
No, not necessarily. As long as you're showing, it's more appreciation and rather than appropriation. And so if you're kind of showing proper respect, and so with the thesis, what we were finding is that it was, walking on eggshells and a little tricky with which way it should go. So what we wanted to move the project in the direction of was something that took the forms as matter of fact.
Right.
What they are, what they are, and we were trying not to associate any meaning, for example, with like Kenneth Frampton and stuff.
And these are from cultures from all over.
Yeah,
right?
Every continent except Antarctica, because there's not too many people up there, but of course. But what we wanted to do was to disassociate them from any sort of meaning. So like Kenneth Frampton and stuff, what he was doing was he was trying to associate too much meaning by putting it in a new context and being like, okay, what's important is that this has great thermal resistance, or and it wasn't giving proper respect to what else that wall was doing, for example.
Right.
And so for the actual thesis project, Atlas, we wanted it to just be the forms matter of fact, and to him to have. Right? Well, yeah, it's me.
Or it's
but
you
also
and
me
several
and
years.
Florencia. She's had obviously as my advisor, she's had a heavy hand and stuff. But yes,
but
mostly I.
No, but it's interesting because a thesis is like from the Greek means to take a position.
Yes.
So in a certain way, thesis is when the student is the teacher and the teacher becomes a student. In other words, precisely because it's like independent work, you make your own point.
Mm-hmm.
There are, weirdly enough, no rules. Like no teacher can say to you, well, you shouldn't do this or you should do this.
Yeah.
So you kind of fly solo, and you did this dangerous flight, and you're identifying why it was dangerous. Like if I go and look at a teepee, and even if I take a photograph of it, that already could be appropriation, right?
Yeah.
You don't even know if you're allowed to look.
It's
right?
Where is that line? It's a very tricky business.
So you're saying I want to be a good person and not damage it.
No.
And then you had this amazing theoretical resource in the kind of formless, the reading of Bataille by Yves Alamboir, Rosalind Krauss and so on. I think it was super interesting because when you show all the pictures that you identified, and you, in my mind, correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of identified all these sort of types, like different sort of forms that you could find in different non-Western cultures, and you gathered them together and said, look, I found all this stuff, I found it, and I'm going to be affected by it, but I don't want to be affected by it like in a bad way.
In a negative way, yes.
But you didn't feel the same about Los Angeles, right? You didn't look at Los Angeles and say, oh, I'm going to be just very careful here. Quite the opposite. You basically slaughtered Los Angeles with chewing gum.
I would say not slaughtered.
No?
With the Civic Center, I lifted everything purposely because I wanted to maintain, especially Grand Park, because it's such an important place for civic engagement for like the community. But I wanted to make it a place that was representation of all the different types of people in LA, where the current Civic Center is very reflective of, architectural types that are generated through Western formalism. And so it doesn't give space to, you know, other people who,
Right.
you know, that's not their type of architecture that they grew up with, and, you know, or reflect where they came from or where their family
Right.
came from, and whether it's currently or generations ago. And so it's to create space for everybody rather than just, you know, giving this very centralized, powerful, iconic type of place that represents government. So, you know, even looking at governmental buildings, they came from Greek temples, and so that's
Right.
technically appropriated. And so it has
I know.
this long lineage of,
know.
you know, these things changing, and it became to represent all these government buildings. And if you look at non-Western countries all over the world, almost all their governments have some sort of like stylobate or, you know, grand entrance up these stairs or
Right.
something, or axial symmetry. And you look at a lot of their floor plans, and even if the outside of the building looks a certain way, a lot of the floor plans are arranged in this very neoclassical kind of manner.
Right, which you identify with power, right? Because you sort of say like the symmetry of the West and so on.
Yeah.
So of course, if I'm even a post-colonial government in Africa, I could appropriate the language of Western classicism because I want to have authority. So I could
Yeah, it
I
could
could
just flip
echo
on the
the
other.
I could echo the colonial authorities that oppress me in order that I could also oppress.
Yeah, it
right?
could be the shoe on the other foot.
So tell me if I'm right. The way I see it is you kind of look at what you call the formless, which would be formless relative to the Western definition of what constitutes form, like the other.
Yeah, it's a
You
play
go to
of
the
words.
other and you show all the forms. So you do this sort of trick of saying, here are the forms of the formless. It's kind of a tricky thing to do. Because it looks like actually the non-Western world that you explore is much more precisely formal, right? And then you say, okay, I'm going to use that as a resource to subvert the power structure that's evident in Los Angeles in the organization of the main sort of political center in the square.
Yes.
So basically it's a kind of the revenge, it's sort of like a revenge movie. And anyway,
More or less.
this is Los Angeles, and without a spin room, nothing's real in Los Angeles, right? So
Yeah.
Los Angeles then gets hit by this wave of sort of non-Western inspired formless elements, which become a kind of viral pink world
Yes.
that subverts the existing world. And so it seems to me that you're sort of saying, and there would be a kind of political bonus of that because it would create diversity, complexity,
Yeah.
something like this?
Something like that, yeah. So what it's proposing to do is to connect people also, not just emotionally to the center of the place that they live, the central government of where they locate, but also a lot of the buildings, they tilt and they connect to one another, or they connect to the existing buildings. And so it provides actual physical connections too, where you're able to move throughout the city. So an additional thing that I wanted to do was implement new type of programming in there. So currently a lot of the programming is just governmental, and there's also a huge shortage of space. They're lacking about 1.1 million square feet of office space, and they're paying millions of dollars every year in leases throughout the city to accommodate all these government officials. And so what this is also doing is providing extra square footage so that these people can come back, but also we can introduce residential, hospitality, retail, cultural.
So you're a goody two-shoes.
Sure.
But you don't have to be. If you were an artist in the 1920s, you didn't want to be a goody two-shoes. You wanted to wake people up, to sort of shock them. What you're saying is, like an architect, you are an architect, right?
Yeah, I want to bring everybody
together.
together.
You're saying like things could be better for more people, and I figured out a way of doing that. That this kind of formless invasion into the highly formalized sort of city hall kind of setup produces a kind of a horizontal, it's sort of horizontal politically. And when I look at your model, you get that. You get the idea that it's sort of a horizontal. So if it's Hollywood, your movie is like yay for the people.
Yeah.
Something I like about the project is actually nobody would guess looking at your project that you had any interest in the non-Western. I think. Does it bother you?
I tried to dissociate it from the meaning as much as possible so that it was just the forms.
Yeah. So
it becomes, it gives space to the people where these forms come from, but
Right.
it's not directly like trying to associate meaning and to do any sort of extra work that
Right.
could be, ambiguous.
Which is what you
or
mean about the
anything.
Frampton thing, that the Frampton is like expressing lots of liberal guilt and saying like obviously the other is better than us, but then is appropriating it in the name of like good architecture.
Yeah.
And you could say even a certain kind of modern architecture. And you're saying, no, I can develop from these indigenous cultures, indigenous only from the Western point of view, I can develop subversive strategies that actually are politically liberating in the West and don't constitute an appropriation. If we had more time, which we don't, because we're like almost going to, because it's a podcast, you just throw a pod and that's it. But the question then is, of course, this division you make between the West and the non-West, this, of course, is much more,
It
complicated.
becomes more gray.
It's much more complicated,
Yeah, it's not
right?
black and white anymore.
But I think that what you do is develop a genuinely original research, and then you take it in a direction that work hasn't gone before. I think that's what a thesis is.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to do.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm glad you see it.
Yeah, I mean, I still think the movie you don't have to be a goody two shoes. Like, if every architect was a goody two shoes, like doing good things for good people, doing the most with the least, for the most.
Yeah.
Sounds great, but if every architect did that, maybe the discipline wouldn't think anymore, right?
Yeah, I could get a little stagnant.
But you're
probably.
saved because so many architects are idiots doing stupid things that it's good to have a kind of good attitude. But sometimes, and this is what I mean about the Japanese restaurants, sometimes maybe even kind of cultural appropriation,
I could say
is a
maybe
thing,
like
right?
American Chinese food is probably pretty badly appropriated, but we all still enjoy it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that sometimes I would defend the need for architecture to be inappropriate. And so your original hesitation, like I got to be careful when looking at the non-Western. Okay, yeah, but you could also say I'm not going to be careful, and I'm interested in the outcomes. Could there be some super positive outcomes from some sort of negative behavior at the beginning of the thesis?
Yeah.
I think you're pretty even. You kind of like all the way through have a kind of political conscience, keeping an eye on how things are going. That's what it is.
Yeah.
We're done.
All right.
So I'm really excited that I get to interview you and talk more about your book. But as a start, before we talk about American Power Box and this beautiful book that has been done, I know that this is the graduate thesis, but you have a little special way of looking at this. And maybe we could just talk a little bit about what you did here as a segue into the book.
Yeah. My thesis is about, it's called American Power Box, and investigated the potential of ontological weakness in the architectural expression of power. And so also the image that is representing my project is an American flag in which the content is hidden behind a layer of plastic that, according to the way you move it on top of it, it changes the identity of the flag itself. So in the same way that something weak, ontologically speaking, can become something that explain multiple identity of the object, so the image is doing that too.
Right, and I think that's really important when you can work on something, a physical manifestation of a thesis, and have it be represented through its documentation. And to say that those ideas can actually translate back into the book itself. So if I set this one aside, and we can pass that to you, your hands might be full at some point.
It's okay.
And then when we look at American Power Box, and right now I'm not sure if people can see, but there is a bit of sheen to it because of the way that the book has been produced with the silver letterpress, or?
Yes, so we laminated the book with silver and metallic sheets, and the intention was the one to, through the fabrication, reveal the machine. So if in the cover everything looks very clean and very professionally done, the moment that the page turns on, the machine starts blurring the lines of what it was the intended content of the book and what is instead the final product and the realization, the manufacturing of it. So the intention was through the crafting of the book to reveal the machine and is weakness mechanics that are not very precise, instead of hiding it. And this is really a premise of the thesis, is the fact that what we're looking at has different faces, and so this book does that too. So whatever is written in the book is printed over and over multiple times to produce a continuous blurry effect and multiple effect in the reading and the perception of the book.
Right, and that seems to carry over the idea of using the lens, but here it actually finds its way into the actual printing, to the point where I see the double happening, or the after effect of what happened once happens again. And so that becomes a really nice way of saying the thesis has a way of finding its representation in the book, especially when you take advantage of certain pages, like the Jasper Johns flag or Andy Warhol, where there is multiple. It looks like, almost like it's been through a real printing process, being able to see the combination of the silver on top of the regular printing.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting that you mentioned these two artists that are part of my book, because they became some sort of diagram and icon for the book itself. So Jasper Johns, and all the idea that is not about the flag, the content is not the American flag, but the continuous representation of it over different mediums, and the medium become really the intention. That was one of the interests. So when I quoted, let's say, graphically speaking, Jasper Johns, I wanted to do an homage, but also trying to push the conversation inside my thesis. And so is Andy Warhol, that when he decided to do contour lines or to blur the image multiple times, he's producing different identities in the same object. So these became two artistic reference icon of the past that I'm trying to not really emulate, but learn from, trying to push them inside the definition of an embassy that is my program for my thesis.
Right, and we should touch a little bit about the actual program of your thesis being the embassy, because it is about the American power box. And there's different references to that in here, where you're exploring precedents that we could see with, I love this one, the Thomas Heatherwick or Jeff Koons. Like, they're just, it's nice to see that there's very contemporary examples, but at the same time you're pulling back in history too, and being able to look at what are ways that you're identifying or bringing different resources to your thesis. But then you also translate that into new work as part of it. One of the pieces I do really enjoy looking at, well, there's many, but I'm going to try and focus on a few here while we can. One of them is these pieces where you've cast them, and I know materiality is one of the areas that you're interested in. And it is this layering or this strata of bringing together different surfaces, color, materials, almost into like almost a nugget or a box too.
Yes.
And so there's this idea of compressing. I don't know if that speaks about a compression of ideas. If
I would not say ideas, but I like the idea that there is a compression of the intentions in the object. So the way we are looking at the object right now is always from our point of view, and since there is not a coherent and singular way of looking at reality through new media, but also through new understanding of the world, so does materiality. So my intention in the production of the book, where the layers of the ink produces a stratification, and the same translation into the material form of architecture through resin and concrete, which are the two elements that we're using, had the intention to produce from their materiality, the very heavy, monumental, and brutalist concrete existence, and also on the other side, the synthetic, digital, but also transparent resin, to start creating layering and overlapping and nesting, where the understanding of the material is not singular, but becomes a different layering, a multiplicitous form of architectural material.
Right, and so that really starts to show up in more detailed views throughout the book. And one of the areas that you also begin to explore is there's a page where you probably know it really well, where you start almost unfolding that exterior of the box. So it becomes a unfolded, beautiful drawing. It looks like you almost have the tabs as if I could take a page from here, cut it out, and reconfigure it back into the representation of those casts.
Yeah, it was really the idea of...
Where is that drawing?
Oh,
I loved it.
Let me go further. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere here. The idea was
There it is.
the one that, well, my object, my architectural object is a perfect cube that contains multiple objects nested inside what is an external, perfectly cubical facade. And so the game in here was the one that, in the same way that when you look at a crystal or at a gem, you can imagine to unfold it and produce a landscape of faces. In the same way, in this case, we were unfolding the cube, like when you do when you were a kid, you were doing the cube of paper. I think the kids nowadays, they don't do that anymore, but I'm old enough to remember. And then you remount it and produce something that is, again, a multiplication of identities inside something that is very clear. And that was also part of the understanding of the project. It was the idea that instead of playing with form per se, so the creating multi-faces in the object to have different angles, different approach, or different opportunities for the user to experience the object. The idea was to have a very low form, very immediate, which is a cube, and then break it inside into these layering of materials and possibility of looking for each user his own identity inside the object.
Right, and that's something that really begins to show up here. But you also explore that. I'm going to skip ahead to others that I know are in here too, such as the way that the box then meets the landscape.
Yes.
And so, I feel like we're also looking at it sort of a larger level, a meta view, seeing the larger piece of the architecture, but once it meets the landscape, it becomes a little bit more specific because pieces have to somehow settle into place, they respond to gravity, and I know that in here, it's about looking at the individual forms. So that original part where you have the layers that are happening all connected or compressed together, suddenly it begins to flatten itself out when it needs to, but then at other times you find a way of reinterpreting it back into being a very three-dimensional experience that one can begin to move through that, feel like they know how to walk across the landscape through it, back out into the landscape.
It was really the intention of the idea that, the general idea of the object was that if he stays in the realm of his own object, his own presence in the world, is limiting the effect that he's producing for real with the users. This is an architectural thesis, it's really about the building. So the general understanding, especially in the case of the embassy, is that the ground around it, surrounding the space, is very specific for the perception of it. And in the case of the embassy, it's really fascinating because the embassies are objects that sit in foreign ground, and to protect their own identity and also security, they create a synthetic ground, they carve out of the city a piece of it. In the same way that when you put something inside a FedEx or Amazon box, the content is nested inside of the private property that is the one of FedEx. So when you put an object inside a FedEx box, the object becomes owned by FedEx. So this is really what it was the ground about. It was creating a way that the building, the object can unfold on the ground in specific ways that are different according to the posture, but maintains a relation to it and a perception of the object that is specific and intended from the architectural point of view.
Right. So that's a really nice way of speaking about many different scales. At one point you're talking about the object that could just be a small object in a box, but that idea of ownership. And how things can end up from one location, be transported into another location, much like the idea of an embassy too, where one country's ideas are then welcomed, hopefully welcomed, into another country, and those ideas are transported and housed within that box. And that seems to be one idea that finds its way through many different layers, that spans the larger thesis that you've worked on and its representation, but also to be able to hear you talk about it as the small scale is a nice way of spanning scales. And I think that's even something you have in here. At one point, I think I saw maybe a FedEx box where, an idea of, I know that these are some of the boxes that you've been looking at.
So it was interesting for
There we go, there's the FedEx box.
Because there is an artist that is Walid Besley that understood this machinery and try to represent it through FedEx. So he's an artist in LA, and what he does, he ships perfect cube of glass through FedEx to the gallery, and when they take them all off the box, they use the box itself as a podium. So it's a very architectural concept. He's creating his own ground. They take off the box of glass, which is of course cracked, which is broken in different ways, and by placing the object that it was supposed to have an identity and making it go through the process of the shipping, it becomes something else. So the reason why we started looking at him is because it's so full of architectural intention, so full of architectural content, that it was the perfect case study, as if it were Jasper Johnson and the world, but in this case it was a lot more contemporary because it's talking about America, the trust that we have in FedEx, and also, you know, when you ship something, not only with FedEx, I guess, with every shipping company, at a certain point you wonder, is he ever going to arrive? Is he going to be intact? And we travel around the world, we know airplane companies, they do the same with our luggages. There is a question, is it going to come intact? This is exactly what this embassy is about. It's about showing the system of the American government and the relation of the government with the hosting country through a box that is not broken. We are not so literal, but it's a box that is able to express different intention of the system inside its architectural content.
So that leads me to think about a question, which is, where do you find slippages between the kind of protective, secured box that we associate with a lot of embassies and areas where you have designed those moments of opening or passage? It'd be nice to know how those two differ in this new work that you're producing.
Well, embassies works generally with areas a lot more public and areas that are a lot more private and secured, in which, for instance, you cannot even have a floor plan of them because it's where really the security apparatus is fitting. And the way that the object itself and also the layering comes back is the fact that I'm creating two different circulations that, visually speaking, they are intertwining, but programmatically they are very separate. So what from the outside looks like a box that is packed, compact, compressed, where you can go anywhere, in the reality is very well divided and defined. And well, I hope the book is saying that, and the object itself is explained.
It does. It is a beautifully produced book that holds many ideas, and I really enjoy seeing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ross Fernandes.
And I'm Laida Aguirre.
And my thesis is called Phantasmagoria. It's essentially a project that's situated in Detroit and is a techno arena with a virtual overlay on top of it. The project works with Phantasmagoria split on a variety of levels that explain the obsession with ruin, that explains the obsession of the digital contemporary, that explains the oral phantasmagoria and spectacle of Detroit techno, and the kind of decline of what was once the most affluent cities in the United States from the 1920s to its eventual decline in the early 70s. The project works on a series of scales and a series of materials to immateriality, and refers to the original Phantasmagoria, which was a spectacle in Paris in late 18th century.
Yeah, I have to say that some of the things I really appreciated about your project when I saw it is that you're managing to sort of supersede this easy binaries between the material and immaterial. Right, the idea that the material, the palpable, that which it exists, can be in contrast to a kind of world of culture, VR, music, techno that you're creating, that those exist one as different from the other. You're managing to kind of provide us with several options within your project, ultimately creating this cohesive gradient between what is material, what is alternative reality, what is virtual, while also incorporating the kind of culture as a tangible, arguably material condition, right? The fact that Detroit was a spot for techno, incorporated into this kind of game of light and shadows, of virtual projections, makes it ultimately that much more material. It's not just a space.
Exactly.
It's not just a set of lights. It is also the sort of technoculture around it that makes the space into an actual space.
Actually, the thing is, it was done exactly the way that, like, I drew parallels from the original spectacle, which was a light show. It was a simple gas lamp projecting demons in churches, and essentially the architecture of the abandoned church turned into hell. So in Detroit, it was a similar thing. You know, you take the industrial phantasmagoria and the kind of ruin factory, and you project neoclassical ruins on top of it. And essentially, I used the alternate thing. Instead of making it into hell, I made it a techno-raver's heaven. You know, kind of looking at other techno-rave cathedrals. You know, they often refer to these kind of nightclubs, very famous ones, as meccas or pilgrimage sites. You know, and Detroit is no short, because in the early 70s, people from Berlin, before the fall of the wall, which is a huge deal in the book, it was basically a pilgrimage site because they needed to find a youth resistance movement sound. And so the founder of Berlin, Tresor, he used to visit in the mid 80s, and essentially that was the sound of Berlin's unification movement. And it was wonderful because it was the phantasmagoria of Detroit's decline in terms of Detroit techno shifted from Detroit straight to Berlin, and now Berlin has made it a cultural icon. And it's sort of sad, and now Dimitri Hegeman is going to bring it, or trying to bring it back. The site I chose was Fisher Body Plant 21, which that was his principal site, but I think he went with another Brazilian investor at the Packard plant, because I think there were so many investors that they thought they could do like a mixed use, high-spirited community. But I personally thought the history of FBP, which I call FBP 21, was just more raw. I don't like the idea of a mixed-use techno-rave. It just sort of doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think we were speaking a little bit earlier about the kind of value of grit also, right?
Yes.
And like of this like kind of larger culture that you're creating around this space, that you're constantly going to be in danger of kind of Disneyfying this thing.
Oh,
and
yes,
it seems like
yes.
in your project you have a really good hold on not letting either one titter into any other space, because the way you're treating the actual material condition, right? When the party is gone, there's that sort of an inability to inhabit it in a sort of comfortable way comes back, and then when the lights are on, everything becomes a kind of ultra reality.
I actually love the word Disneyfication. That's something exactly that I come from Dubai, a city of Disneyfication, and essentially I hate clubs. I mean, to me, clubs are like, it started in the 60s and 70s as a typology of radical thought.
Yeah.
It was less about music and more about community, art, and these wonderful, installations and radical lifestyles. And Disneyfication is one of the biggest problems with the kind of culture right now. Yeah. VIP zones and popping champagne bottles and these kind of like gross displays of wealth. That was one of the things that I wanted the building. And so when I say that the phantasmagoria of the building is a kind of like, it's a phantom zone, it's controlled by an AI that does not allow the Disneyfication.
Right. And ultimately, right, the discipline of architecture also has a very kind of well-documented problem with not kind of arriving at the nuance of like whether this can you contain grit, right? Can you contain that kind of cultural edge in a state of perpetuity, because you're making it a building. It often tends to, once you kind of make it permanent, it loses that sort of edge, and then you start kind of dealing with all this like secondary problems.
It's so true.
That's why I like that what you're doing with essentially your building is by adding the grit and the culture in a more ephemeral way, it has the potential to sustain it longer.
Exactly.
That is the goal.
Yeah. The funny thing is, especially in the type of research and the way that we were expected to approach this, we started with collections, which was the theme of the thesis. And so we collected a lot of information about typologies of these things, and everything that you researched, especially that was worth documenting, always had that grit and culture that you spoke of.
Right.
There are so many nightclubs around the world, especially in America. I mean, you have some of the greatest festivals that are here, but it's all been Disneyfied. The wonder, that you saw in Studio 54, or the wonder that you saw in other, like the Berghain that we were discussing before. One of the critics in one of the reviews then wondered, like, what would be the reality of setting up a 750,000 techno arena?
But it's essential to acknowledge, right?
Yeah,
it's essential
it
to
really
acknowledge
is,
so that we can in some way discuss this in real ways.
Exactly.
Berghain is dealing with it at all times, right?
Yes,
Whether it's through Yelp review or whether it's through the kind of culture at large, this spaces get qualified and they get hyped out and they get destroyed by their own kind of the kind of exhaust that they create through the kind of environments
I
that
think
they
so
have.
too. And I feel like, often people think that architecture does not have any grasp or control of that. And I often beg to differ, because it's not so much about what DJ is playing there. It's not so much about the sound system. It's not so much about what type of people are allowed in there. It's nothing like that. I think what was amazing about the 60s and 70s and when people partied, it was not about money. In fact, the counterculture was an amazing movement where you didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to have an agenda. It didn't matter. You could bring your kids to the club. It was not meant to be a deviant form of coming together. It was just meant to be, of course, the culture of what later on went into drugs and sex and rock and roll, that kind of like mass hysteria. I think the original spirit of it was just the development of wonderful music and the ability of a society that was being divided, especially with middle class people just being caught in the middle, which is what you find most of the demographic of who go to these clubs, is because they work all day, they don't have enough money to kind of like work all night partying, and essentially I loved places where they could just go have a beer and listen to some wonderful music and just, another thing that the Phantasmagoria often deals with is hallucination and a sort of like dreamlike state, which is apparent in the way that I've treated the digital. It's like you used the word ethereal and ephemeral, which were the key words that I worked with in the aesthetic. Is that essentially that's the escapism that they wanted in the aesthetics, that we often love dreamlike, lucid, hallucinatory spaces. I mean, they're just tropes that just, the escapism that we try to seek through music. I think with the neoclassical Detroit being this kind of ephemeral, fleeting space, it just works. It's, for me, a phantasmagoric event or space should be something in which all the elements that are there together just make you wonder how the hell they were put together. And just, like,
I think it's funny. I think you have the sort of right attitude towards your project to actually build the project. And then as a small like counter to that, I would argue that that you actually need a certain amount of both bad things and good things. That there is a certain amount of sort of like sex in rock and roll that makes rock and roll also sexy, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
I think there's like, in a way, there's no denying that Berghain can stay afloat, because there's parts of Berghain that you and I don't go to.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's the kind of like place, that the kind of darkness of that space that keeps a club like that as more floating above certain ideas of digestibility, right? That it can become this like kind of easy cultural trope, which it is ultimately now, right? I mean, but there's a small nugget there that kind of keeps it too gritty for the very, very mainstream tourist, right?
Absolutely, I think so.
And in fact, they pick them off the line, right? And we know this.
I was lucky enough to get in because I was able to answer a simple question about the history of one of the. I mean, Marcel Detman is a resident, but I was lucky enough to be able to answer the question of the track list of one of the albums. So they were like, okay, cool.
The criteria.
You don't seem
to the
to
kingdom,
be. You definitely aren't a Berliner.
Yeah.
But if you're coming from the desert, we're gonna get you in. We're gonna allow you in, and it was wonderful. But I think that's wonderful, because I mean, it may seem like, I mean, it becomes infamous, like, oh, you got in. I mean, I don't think it's so much about you getting in, but it's more like the right type of people getting in. People who aren't trying to video the place, people who don't really care too much about like what it stands for, apart from the fact that it really is a place where you can be yourself, where, you know, and I think what you said is right. You need that sort of grittiness and something mystifying deep down inside that most people probably don't, not that they don't want to go there.
These are ultimately a set of ingredients that I think like it would be impossible for you and I to identify, right? What the right mix is. When did Burning Man kind of turn the page into
I think so,
into a more corporate space? When is Bernheim going to ultimately like succumb to the forces that are like upon it all the time?
I think so.
To make it this kind of you know, like
really
souvenir. Like when are we going to have a souvenir store like in Bernheim, right?
That's so true. Yeah.
But I think that you have this sort of a certain positivity behind your project that it would definitely get it off the ground.
I think, you know, it's just because like typology, and that's why I call it a revenant typology. It's a new type of thing. And I often use the word also like when I'm doing it, I say multi-dimensional, and I say like ever-changing.
Yeah.
The reason I say ever-changing is you're right. If it's ever-changing, and I'm not saying adapting to the times like making itself relevant, but more like is not resistant to change, because maybe
that's what makes it relevant, though, right?
You know?
It's not the attempt at becoming relevant.
Yeah.
It's the fact that like the approach
Yes.
that you have is the relevant approach. It's one that
exactly.
is like can succumb to its own changes, can essentially give itself in to a day to a day where, well, this is no longer this kind of turned the page into a space of your you know, maybe not your liking, or a kind of cultural participation that is seems like a demise of what the earth space was originally like departed from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the one thing I like about especially architecture of this. You know, you never think of nightclubs as being an architectural thing that gets designed. You know, it's like, okay, so we found this place, get the interior designer in. I think the thing that makes Berghain amazing, and which is it's a huge inspiration to what I've done. It's just that it's literally what would the Berghain be if we could have a ghost AI over it? You know, it's just what it stands for, and it's the spirit of place. I'm sorry to use so many horror story tropes, but it really is the spirit of place. You know, there's something about it that has this kind of freedom in the way the architecture was not even built for it, but it just becomes this cavernous temple. Like it's just where you can be free.
In contrast to that fort, I'm really curious how your sort of the rigor of your columns with all sides sort of being gone will act as a contrast. I think it will be like an amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the best thing about at least just working with this is I couldn't find any references for something like this, and it was both super scary because usually I'm a person that like it's usually very comforting to have a reference at least. But I thought because this is a personal thesis and it's a reflection of what my interests are, I wanted it to be excessive. Like I wanted it to be the same kind of excessive that some of my favorite techno events and venues are, especially run by some of my heroes, are just like, I would like this to be as phantasmagoric as the original Phantasmagoria. I want people to feel that.
Cool. I hope I get it to get in.
Thank you.